Okay, herd him in. I guess we're going to start. Good evening. So welcome to the Interfaith Network on Mental Illness, or INME's. I think it's our 10th annual conference, and if I'm wrong, please don't tell me until afterwards. But I'm Ann Weir, I'm chair of INME, so I'm glad to see so many of you out on this really lovely spring evening. We promised William that he would experience spring in the Rockies. I suspect tonight this doesn't exactly meet his expectations. But however, despite the weather, we are really honored and pleased to have William Moyers with us. Before we get to the main event, I'd like to thank our sponsors and supporters. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Board of Directors of INME and the Planning Committee of the Interfaith Network on Mental Illness, our co-sponsors, Mental Health Partners, which provides the direct mental health and substance use treatment to more than 22,000 local residents in 2015 and touched 34,000 lives with education, training, and community outreach. And Windhorse Community Services, a home-based integrative treatment approach whose primary activity involves creating individually tailored therapeutic living environments for people with a variety of mental health challenges. We're also grateful to all our other sponsors whose names you can find on the inside of the program. We could not have put on this quality program without the help of these groups. If you are a member of one of these groups, please stand so that we may acknowledge you. Come on, not everybody up. Come on. Thanks, everybody. You can see that we have a lot of support. So last but not least, I want to thank our founding members, Joanne Kelly and Alan Johnson. Without their vision, INME would not be here today. A very, very special thanks to Alan, who has chased this dream of bringing William here for over 2 years. It is through his tenacity and indomitable energy. I shouldn't have put that word in there. I just knew. Oh, well, you got to joke about something, right? That we are able to bring William here tonight. We all miss you, Alan, but I got an email from him today, and he is enjoying those wonderful, healthy waters in Italy. So before we move on to the main attraction, I just want to make one more announcement. As you can see in your program, there's going to be a time for questions and answers after William speaks. So as we move through the evening, jot down your questions. Then after William's talk, we will collect those responses, look for key themes to bring forth as questions, and William will have the chance to answer them. As you might have gathered, we're honored and anxiously awaiting William's riveting and heartfelt talk about his journey with addiction and beyond. He is by Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation's Vice President of Public Affairs and Community Relations. He is a passionate spokesperson for all those living with the challenge of addiction. His story has been a vital and inspiring instrument for change in the recovery field. William is the author of Broken, My Story of Addiction and Redemption. It's a New York Times best-selling memoir. His most recent book, Now What? An Insider's Guide to Addiction and Recovery, navigates the maze of addiction, how to find help, what it means to recover, and the importance of openly sharing our stories. He has appeared on Oprah and Larry King Live and is a regular contributor on Good Morning America. A former journalist for CNN, his work has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, and Newsweek. William's experience does indeed span the gamut from addiction to recovery. William, we are truly honored that you have come all this way from sunny Minnesota to be with us tonight. Please join me in giving a really warm welcome to William Moyers.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you all for being here on this cold and dreary night in Boulder, Colorado. You could have used it as an excuse to stay home, but I'm grateful that you took the time out of your busy schedules in the evening to be here with us tonight. Since we're on the subject of Alan and the weather, and since he's not here, I can make a joke at his expense. But he was like a dog on a bone trying to track me down to get me to speak. I give hundreds and hundreds of talks, and I just couldn't work it out to get to Boulder. I was in Aspen twice last year, speaking at the Institute in July, and in Aspen again in September. So I have to be careful how many times I come to Colorado. And Alan would not let go, and so he wouldn't. And one of the hooks he gave me was, William, we know you live in the upper Midwest, in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and how brutal that late winter can be there in April. Why don't you come out to Boulder at the end of April, get a little dose of sunshine. Where's the camera? Thanks, Alan. But I know that tonight we're going to talk a little bit about faith as an emphasis to our conversation and to our pathways of recovery, because a lot of us are recovering in one way, shape, or form, and faith is an important component to that. But so because I know I'm in a like-minded audience, I'm going to really ask you to please pray for me, because I have to get out of here tomorrow. I have to get on an airplane at DIA at 11 o'clock to get back to Minnesota so I can go to Charlotte, North Carolina on Saturday morning. And if I don't get out of here tomorrow, based on the 5 to 8 inch snowfall, if I don't get out of here tomorrow, they're not going to be nearly the audience in Charlotte that you all are going to be tonight. They're going to be very angry. So please pray for me. I'm going to get out of here. Alan got me, and I'm glad to be here. And I was so impressed today to be with the sponsors and over at the Interfaith offices. We had a little luncheon. It was a great conversation, and I knew it was going to be okay. I knew this was going to be a great night because I read on the website for Interfaith, Joanne's. Where's Joanne? There she is. I read your testimonial as to why you were one of the co-founders along with Alan for Interfaith, and it spoke volumes to really the message I bring here tonight, which is this one. Faith is critical. Faith is critical to the journey that I have experienced in my whole life. But faith without works is dead. And it is no miracle that I am in recovery. I recover not just because of my faith, and not just because of the hard work I do to stay in remission from my illness, but I recover because of the professionals that have touched my life all along that journey, many of whom, while they didn't touch my life directly, many of whom out there today are the faith workers, the professionals who work in the field of mental illness and addiction, or both. And so in the same way that the minister said that day that your son didn't come to church, Joanne, that if you only had faith, you'd be okay. You don't need to take your meds. In the same way, it isn't just faith alone that brought me through the abyss and onto the road of redemption. It was the work, the continued hard work of the professionals who don't just lay their hands on an addicted person like me and say you're healed. It's not that simple. But utilize faith and grace and the know-how of MSWs and LADCs and CDCs and all those other licensed issues that we all have to be as professionals that really allow us to recover or to continue to recover. So I want to tip my hat to all the professionals who are out in the audience today and in the community from wherever you come from, who may have their own faith and may be able to tap into the faith of the mentally ill or the addicted, but to do it in a professional way with a dignity and respect that is so critical to my ability to be present in the world today. For you all, I am truly grateful. Faith without works is dead. And even though I was a man of faith growing up, it was not my faith alone that got me to where I am. It was my lack of my work in my faith that got me to this point on the morning of October the 12th of 1994. There was a sharp rap on the door followed by a muffled but unmistakable command from a voice outside in the hallway. We want the white guy, just the white guy. We know he's in there. He comes out now and there's no trouble for anyone later. I was the white guy. And I knew in that instant that my family's desperate search to track me down had ended at this decayed two-story apartment in a violent pocket of Atlanta's inner city. Terrified, I rushed around the room trying to warn the other crackheads to sit still and keep quiet. It wasn't funny back then. Don't panic, I whispered. They'll go away. But nobody was listening because everybody was as high and as scared as I was. We bumped into one another as we tried to find a way out. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. We were like wild animals trapped by a wind-whipped forest fire. Or was it my father, my mother, my wife? My mind flashed back to that morning 4 days earlier, the morning of October the 8th of 1994, when I'd left my house in suburban Atlanta. I remember kissing 4-month-old Thomas and 2-year-old Henry goodbye. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I told my wife that I needed to run some errands before dinner. I drove to the parking lot on the corner of Boulevard and Ponce Leon Avenues, approached a drug dealer with a thick scar running from his left ear down to the corner of his mouth, and paid him $100 for 6 marble-sized rocks of crack cocaine. I held them in my hand and thought, these are going to keep me going for a day or two. They were gone in 4 hours. Now the knocking became a relentless pounding that shook the door frame. I thought about escaping out the back porch to the vacant lot and just running. But where could I go? They would find me, just like they had found me in Harlem and in St. Paul. I'd been running for 5 years, and now I had run out of options. And so on the morning of October the 12th of 1994, in a full-blown relapse from my chronic disease, yes, addiction, like mental illness, like diabetes, like hypertension, like HIV, AIDS, like all those other chronic illnesses, it's a chronic disease, which means what? None of our sponsors tonight, not the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation where I work, none of our sponsors tonight cure addiction. Why? Because there is no cure. There's a solution, thank goodness. A lot of us in this room are living in this solution. But there is no cure for addiction. And if the addicted person or the person who has the mental health issue is not engaged in the recovery process, what happens? Nothing. Well, it's like the disease of addiction being cunning, baffling, and powerful. It's also patient. It waits. And if you don't invest in the process of taking your meds and connecting up there and working with others and doing all the other things that we count towards our recovery program, if we don't do that, we relapse. And on the morning of October 12th of 94, I've relapsed after 3 years of continuous abstinence. I use the word abstinence in quotes because as I have learned in my long journey, there's more to sobriety than abstinence, and there's more to recovery than sobriety. And I was dry for 3 years, but I was not actively working my program of recovery that would have kept my disease at bay in remission. And so I've relapsed. And so there's somebody banging on the door. I'm in a crack house in Atlanta, Georgia, the very toughest part of the inner city of Atlanta. What do? I'm not ignorant to the disease. I've been to treatment twice already in the late 80s and early 90s at the world-renowned Hazelden Foundation. So it's not like I'm ignorant. So what did I do the morning of October 12th of 94 when I have been running for 5 years and now I know the gig is up and I've run out of options? What did I do? Pardon? Surrendered? I wasn't quite there yet. Which means I got high one more time. That's how chronic with the disease of addiction I was. So much so far down the continuum of my chronic disease had I gone, that not even the substance is working anymore. I mean, isn't it ironic, too, when we come to deal with an illness like addiction, or as I call it, substance use disorders, or mental health issues, more often than not, those of us who are afflicted with the disease or the illnesses, we run in the very opposite direction of the help that in this case was manifesting itself there. That is why it's so difficult for you as professionals and you as family members to steer your loved one or your client or your patient towards that knocking door sometimes. Because unlike a lot of other chronic diseases, people like me go in the exact opposite direction of where the solution is. And so I got high one more time. But as I said, I was so chronic with the disease that not even the substances were working anymore. I didn't know how to live. I couldn't imagine living my life with drugs any more than I could imagine living my life without them. You've been there, right? Faith without works is dead. And so I get high that last time, but I've gone so far down into the abyss that not even the substances are working anymore. I take that last hit, up I go, up here I go, and then down there I lie, and then this is what happens. I folded my arms over my chest, longing for comfort and for peace. Comfort and peace. I was so sick and tired of it all. And in that moment, I realized the hopelessness of my situation. And in a sudden, brief flash of clarity, I asked myself, now what? I stared at the filthy wood floor littered with half-empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and used syringes. The answer to that simple question, now what? The answer wasn't here in this room anymore. It was all over. I was done. And so up off the floor of that crack house I came on the morning of October 12th of 94. I came up off the floor of that crack house through some power greater than myself, some power greater than the drugs that had hijacked my brain and stole my soul. There was a time when I thought I came up off of that floor and that the power greater than myself that had taken me off of that floor was my higher power. I choose to call that higher power God. But I have struggled in my journey to decide where God's role played in lifting me up off of that floor, and if in fact God did have a role in lifting me up off of that floor, why didn't he lift all the other hopeless and helpless souls in that crack house up off of that floor and take them to that same door? Why was it me? And I don't have an answer for that. I don't know that it was God's grace. Because if it was God's grace, then why weren't they all graced? Those men and women in that crack house that day were no different than I was, except for two things. What was it? I was the white guy. Yeah. I was the only white guy. And as I have always said, addiction and mental health do not discriminate. And neither should recovery from them. But even look around this room tonight. Interesting. We got to do more to level the playing field for those of us like me who are no different except for one, their skin color was something different than mine that day. And there was another difference. And what was that second difference that was separating me from them? Money, my dad, my family, my faith. I was ready. Well, okay, I'll gather all of those up. You know what I'll call that? Hope. Hope in the form of this. Why? Because while I had given up on William, and as I said, I couldn't imagine living life either way, under the influence or not under the influence. While I had given up on me, guess what? My family, my church, my doctor, my employer, my community had not given up on me. They didn't like what had happened to me, but they weren't ready to let go of me either. And how that manifested itself was in what? The two deputy sheriffs from the Fulton County Sheriff's Department who were going, William, we want the white guy, just the white guy. He comes out now and there's no trouble for anyone later. I was the white guy. I was the one that had the community of support holding on to me when I was going down. Hope. What else could it have been? And I came up off of that floor. When I couldn't answer the question, now what? I thought, okay, I must be done. And there it was. I opened the door. The two deputy sheriffs are there, not to arrest me, because ironically, the only law that I was breaking that day was the possession of the narcotics that were in my bloodstream. And I suppose they could have arrested me, but as we learned in the war on drugs, waging a war against people who have addiction or have mental illness, incarcerating them, it doesn't solve the solution. Maybe temporarily, but it doesn't solve the solution. And so I thought, well, that's hope. So yeah, sure, I'll go. Sure, I'm ready. I'm ready now. I got hope. And this is what happened in the last minute. A hard, steady rain was falling as we approached the gray van parked at the curb in front of the crack house. The sliding door opened and I collapsed into the back seat. My father was sitting in the front passenger seat. Turning around to look at me, he saw a 35-year-old crack addict who hadn't shaved, showered, or eaten in 4 days. A man who had walked out on his wife and 2 young baby boys and ditched his promising journalism career at CNN. A broken shell of a man, a pale shadow of the human being that he had raised to be honest, loving, and responsible. His firstborn son. Silence. You're angry, I said. You guys are a tough crowd. I didn't know what else to say. That's hardly the word for it, my father replied, his voice harsh and cold like the rain outside. More silence. There's nothing more I can do for you, my father said. I'm finished. All these years later, my father tells me that's where the conversation ended. But whether I imagined it or not, and I did not imagine it, but I gave my father the benefit of the doubt in my memoir. Why? Because a memoir is memory, and his memory is different than mine. But I can tell you, and he's acknowledged it. My father said what I'm about to tell you what he said. But whether I imagined it or not, I heard my father say something else to me that morning of October the 12th of 1994. My father said, I hate you. And I remember looking into my father's eyes and speaking my deepest truth. I hate me too. Oh, wow. I've been lobbying for the last 20 years to get insurance companies and public policy people in the news media to understand that addiction and mental illnesses are illnesses, because they are, but you know, they are unlike other illnesses in that they can cause fathers in that moment of utter fear and hopelessness and helplessness to think in that moment that he hates his oldest son. It's not like any other illness when it can cause the addicted person, me, to think in that moment of sheer fear and now what? That I hate myself too. Remarkably, and you all are an educated, learned audience, so what I'm about to tell you doesn't surprise you, but when I talk about this, not with this level of detail in different communities, what I am about to say next really shocks people, it won't shock you because you know what's coming. So there I am. I come out of the crack house. I get in the van. My father says what he says to me. I express what I express to me. And, you know, it worked. I got well, and I've stayed well for the last 21 years now. It was not a miracle. It was love, compassion, forgiveness, and the professional expertise of a lot of people who had to work with this very chronic addict and alcoholic in treatment for 100 days in 1994. But what people can't fathom, who don't understand what brings us into this room tonight, is how it was that somebody like me could ever have gone down that road. I mean, as some of you know, because I've shared parts of this story before, maybe you've read Broken, I lacked for nothing growing up. I'm not a product of a broken home, being abused, or lacking for anything. I had everything growing up. I'm the product of two parents who loved me and love me today unconditionally. My parents have been married for 62 years. I don't come from a broken home. I lacked for nothing morally. My parents taught me the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, love and hate. I lacked for nothing emotionally. I had some teenage issues. We all have them, but I was a pretty solid citizen even as a teenager. I lacked for nothing, even spiritually. I wasn't a disbeliever or a non-believer or didn't know what I believed. When I share my story of what I had growing up, I talk about my father being the journalist Bill Moyers. A lot of old-timers know who he was. Some of you younger types wouldn't know that. But my father has been a very successful journalist. Most people would know that he had a 35-year career at PBS and CBS. He's won 50-some-odd Emmys, 4 Pulitzers. He had a pretty good career. Now, if you're from the right side of the equation, you might not think so. But he's been a pretty steady presence, okay? Some of you, especially either Wikipedia addicts or people who would have followed my career would know that before my dad was a journalist, he was Lyndon Johnson's chief of staff and press secretary. Yep, on November the 22nd, 1963, our lives changed too. My father had no intention of serving the president of the United States. He was just along for the ride for a little bit, and then he was going to go back to Texas. But that day changed our lives. So my father was Lyndon Johnson's chief of staff and press secretary. Before that, my father set up the Peace Corps under John Kennedy in 1961. And what a couple of the old graybeards in here might remember, if they know who my dad was way, way back, and why I emphasize this point and why it is entirely germane to Joanne's and her husband's story and to so many other stories, is before all of those things, my father, when I was born in 1959 in Fort Worth, Texas, my father was an ordained Southern Baptist minister. Wow. Yeah, no, most people don't realize that. Yeah. All he ever wanted to really do in his life was pastor a church, seriously, in Texas. And he and my mother did pastor a church when I was born in May of 1959. He was in seminary. Why do I emphasize all those points, particularly that last point? To say that, you know what? You can have it all. Oh, sure, a lot of people who are addicts or have mental illness have it as a result of a PTSD experience or all those other things that we're about to talk about. But the fact of the matter is I had it all, even that. I grew up as a person of faith. I rarely questioned my faith. I believed in God, and every night around the dinner table, before we talked about the war in Vietnam or the Rolling Stones or Watergate or all those other current event things, we always would hold hands. My mother, my father, my sister, my brother, and I we would say, God is great, God is good, and we thank him for our food. Amen. Okay? And I had no problem with that. So I had it all, and yet still, what happened to me? Well, I had 2 other things as well. And you know what they are, right? One of them is this. And what is this? It's a brain that is rewired. It's wired differently than 90% of the rest of the population of wherever we come from. Maybe not the rest of the population here tonight, because I have a hunch I'm with a lot of friends and fellow travelers. But I didn't know it at the time because my parents never talked about the genetic predisposition, though we should have. And by the way, that's one of my call to actions tonight. If you are a recovering person who's recovered from mental illness or substance abuse disorders or both, you have an obligation to talk about that with your children and your grandchildren. Why? Because there's a genetic predisposition. We didn't know it when I was growing up. It wasn't an issue we didn't think. But I have a brain that, as we learn, science is telling us all kinds of things about the intricacies of the brains of people like mine and some of yours, right? About how they just are different. So I had a brain that was wired differently. And what else did I have? Allison, you can't guess this because you know the answer to it. But what else did I have? I had this. And what is this? It's a hole in the soul. H-O-L-E, in the soul. Mine is right here. It's underneath my rib cage. And my hole in the soul aches with a sense of imperfection. I actually believe that all human beings have a hole in the soul. It's why we yearn. It's why we explore our faith. It's why we want to go to the moon. It's why we want to ski the Black Diamond. It's why we want to run a marathon. It's why we want to read a good book. I think human beings are wired through the Spirit to pursue, to yearn. Nothing's wrong with that. You don't become mentally ill or have a substance use disorder because you have a hole in the soul. No. But when you have a hole in the soul like mine that aches with a sense of imperfection, do you know how difficult it is for me to live in the skin of a body, the skin of a human being? Why? Because human beings are imperfect people, right? We're all imperfect, even though we're all very smart. But when I was young, long before I ever took a drink or a drug, I ached here. Some people would say, well, William, you had the hole in the soul because your father was on the cover of Time and Newsweek magazine the same week in 1964. That might have aggravated it. Well, William, you have a hole in the soul because your mother was a very successful CEO of a media company. Well, maybe that exacerbated it. But the fact of the matter is I have a hole in the soul because I don't like being imperfect. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, by the way, talks about us as being what? Restless, irritable, and discontent in our own skins. We itch. And I itched. And I itched. And this thing was sitting up here. I didn't know where it was about to come into play. But where it itched was down here with that sense of imperfection. By the way, it was exacerbated by a major incident that occurred to me when I was 13 years old. And I would rarely talk about this, which means I'm going to go over tonight. But I think it's entirely appropriate given the interfaith network. I grew up believing in God. I'm going to come back to that later about the big difference between believing in God and trusting in God. But it didn't matter back then. I believed in God. But that belief was sorely tested in July of 1971 when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And I witnessed the death of a family that was standing underneath a tree in a national forest in Red River, New Mexico. I watched lightning touch the top of this tree. It was only one of 10 million trees in the forest, and they were standing under that tree. And I saw lightning strike that tree, peel that bark off of that tall pine like a barber pole, and bang! Poof, knocked them all down and killed 4 of them. I thought it was 6, but after the book came out, I learned that there actually were survivors to that story, and that's another story for another day. And on that day of July the 19th of 1971, my faith was sorely tested to the point that I could not get my arms, much less my head, around this all-powerful higher power. If God was really that powerful, then why didn't he take that lightning bolt and put it over there on that tree? I could not grasp that if God was that powerful, why didn't he do that? And if that wasn't act of nature, then why couldn't God steer it elsewhere? Or why would he be that kind of God that would allow that to happen? I would explore that, but I will say that it aggravated this thing a great deal. So there you go. I got this little struggle with faith as a teenager. I got a hole in the soul. I'm restless, irritable, and discontent. But I don't look too bad on the outside, and I got everything to live for. You know, I got it all. But I wasn't a happy youth. I wasn't a bad youth. I wasn't a malcontent, but I just was uncomfortable. Until that day, a few years later in the summer of 1975, when in my summer job, I was mowing the grass at the Aspen Institute in Aspen. I used to be the lawn guy there in the summers. My parents were moderating institutes back in the 70s. And one day my older colleague said, "You want to smoke this?" And I smoked marijuana for the first time. It was the very first substance I ever ingested into my body. For those of you who doubt it's a gateway drug, for some of us who have this and have this, it's just as much a gateway drug as a cold beer or a warm shot of whiskey or Percocet or heroin or whatever. Okay? Not for everybody, but for those of us who got this and this. And when I smoked marijuana for the first time, I found the answer to this. I didn't have to try so hard anymore. Oh, yeah, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. What I did not bargain for was that on the day that I willfully, voluntarily smoked marijuana, what I did not bargain for was that it would soothe this or that it would turn on this. And what is this? It's a light switch in my brain which I cannot turn off of my own free will. It does not absolve me of doing this. That does not absolve me of getting your good counsel and finding recovery. But when you got this, and you got this, and you do this or that, woo! We know it. That's how we have to talk about the illnesses that bring us into this room tonight. In the same context, we talk about recovery from them. That they are, in some ways, very easy to understand, and some ways very mysterious. But at the bottom line is that when you have this and you have this, you have trouble when you do these things. And that's how I functioned for the next 15 years. From the moment I smoked marijuana in Aspen, Colorado, to the time I came out of a crack house in Harlem, New York, in 1989. 15 years. 15 years. And people say, but you didn't look like an addict or an alcoholic. And that's the point, isn't it? That's why I really dedicated my efforts to explaining the disease and the recovery process in the context that I've just shared it with you. So that people can see that you can have everything or have nothing. And you can become an addict or you can suffer from mental illnesses. And that not even your faith alone is necessarily going to be what delivers you to redemption. Because I struggled. I went to my first treatment in 1989 from New York City. And when I got to Hazelden in the fall of '89, it was pretty easy for me to understand that I could not control my use of alcohol or crack cocaine. That was hard to refute. But I saw my illness in a way that I see myself as being left-handed. I'm left-handed, okay? I have to compensate for being left-handed because it's primarily a right-handed world and just the way it is. So I'm left-handed. I acknowledge that. I saw my alcoholism and my drug dependence in that same way. I saw it as part of me, but I never did see it as all of me. I didn't become an addict and an alcoholic. Alcoholism and drug addiction became me. And what I would learn through the process of relapse, what I would learn even in my rediscovery of faith and how I molded my illness and my recovery to my faith and vice versa, was that if I was going to recover from it, I had to do it all. I had to become a recovering person in the same way I had become an addict and an alcoholic. Addiction was in every cell in my body. by the time I got to my first treatment, which meant that if I was going to recover from it, then I needed to put into every cell in my body recovery. Sometimes literally and sometimes figuratively. But the point is it takes a lot of work. And that for this addict and alcoholic who's also struggled with situational depression, it wasn't just enough for me to take a pill. Now, don't get me wrong. Taking our meds is really, really important. We're not likely to recover from our schizophrenia or our eating disorder or our PTSD if we don't take what the professionals suggest that we take. I get that. I revere that. But what I was to learn in recovery is that to fully recover from my illnesses, I had to see the disease as all of me and to see it as one of the mind and the body and the spirit. That's why my recovery program, which has an emphasis on the 12 steps, is a program that What's really interesting about the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous? The substance is only mentioned one time. In the first step of the 12 steps, which is just one pathway to recovery, by the way. Doesn't work for everybody, but it works for some people. The first step says we admitted we were powerless over alcohol or whatever the substance is, and our lives have become unmanageable. There is no other reference to that substance that brought me to that crack house or to the detox unit or to the psych ward multiple times. There's no more reference to the substance until the 12th step, which says you work with other addicts and alcoholics. Why is that? Because, as I said to you, my illness and my recovery are much more than just one component. My problem is not living life with substances. My challenge is learning to live life without substances. I don't like to live my life on life's terms. I want to accentuate the highs and mitigate the lows. And so I always want to alter my experience, which is why my recovery program talks about all the other pieces of me that have to be worked on. Progress, not perfection. I did not understand that. I saw it as left-handedness. I saw it as just a treatment episode and so on, and it doesn't work. And when I came out of this crack house on October 12th of 94 and was for 8 days on suicide watch on a rubber mat on a floor in a treatment center in Atlanta. No shoelaces, no belt buckles, no cords or ties or anything that I could have used to destroy myself, which is what I really wanted to do in those days of total desperation. I had to lie there and I had to be open to whatever. And the whatever that happened to me was a whisper in my ear. And the whisper was, St. Paul. I did not know the story of St. Paul the Saint at the time. I should have. Some people have compared my journey to the journey of St. Paul the Saint. I wouldn't be so brazen to suggest that, but I understand why they would say that. So and you got to remember, I'm in a detox. I'm in psych unit. I'm on a suicide watch for 8 days. There's nobody else in the place during that period. And yet I hear it just as clearly as I'm looking at you. Or I heard somebody cough back there, St. Paul. And I knew in that moment that some power greater than myself was saying, you know what, William, you are really, 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 really sick, and you're not going to make it unless you start to take orders and start to trust the process. And for me, what that whisper was telling me to get serious, to the point that when I got out of treatment, I went back to St. Paul, Minnesota, where I had spent some time in the late 80s after my treatments. Yeah. I liked the town. It was accommodating. In fact, it had a feel to it like Boulder does, actually. I don't know how accommodating you all are to the recovery community, but I get a sense that you are accommodating. Look, we have a nice turnout tonight. So I got a sense that it's here like it is in St. Paul, but I always say that St. Paul is the crossroads of recovery in America. There are more of us there in various stages of recovery from mental illness or addiction, or mostly both, than anywhere else in the world. And I knew that if I was going to make it, I better stop believing in God and start trusting in God. That God would do for me what I could not do for myself. That, it's really important to have faith, however you define faith. But, as I said at the beginning, faith without works the odds are not too good. And I made it to this moment. Remarkably, 18 months after I'd come out of that crack house, and I'm back in Minnesota with no job, a wife who doesn't work outside the home, and 2 baby boys, and no clue of what I'm going to do, but just following good, orderly direction. I opened up the classified ads at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune one day looking for clients for my failing media consulting business. And there it is right in front of me. Wanted, public policy specialist, Hazelden Foundation. It was like somebody had thrown a pie in my face. I went to treatment twice at Hazelden. I'm a statistical failure in their books. Once I left against staff advice. And I'm going to apply for a job there? And I got the job. Now they pay me. And I got the keys to the front door, really. What is that? Well, I can't explain it except that I think through my faith journey, which is part of my recovery journey, I had to be open to the possibility. Open to the possibility. I do really believe that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Because how else can I explain it, that I'm here, really? I mean, all I ever wanted to do was smoke marijuana and Aspen. I was 15, now I'm 57. And I'm with all these sponsors here tonight and professionals who work in the field at the law school. Well, I got here because I got well. And I didn't get well just because I had faith. I got here because I trusted that those who knew more than me could help me and that I could be open to the possibility. And that when I opened the paper that day, I was present to the opportunity, to go to work for a place that I owe all the rest of my career to. And when I went to work for Hazelden in 1996, 20 years ago, this year, February 29th, 1996, my very first day on the job, I talked about this afternoon. My boss said to me on my first day on the job, he said, William, I want you to go out and change public policy and get insurance companies to stop discriminating against the mentally ill and those who have substance use disorders. I said, okay, I'll do that. And he said, while you're at it, he says, I want you to get rid of the stigma of mental illness and addiction. I want you to enlighten the public and the policymakers about the fact that addiction and mental illnesses are illnesses. Treatment can work and recovery is possible. Get rid of the stigma. And I said, sure, I'll be happy to do that. And I said, where's the money? I worked for a large not-for-profit now called the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. We were Hazelden since we were founded in 1949. But a year and a half ago, we merged with the Betty Ford Center. We have a children's program, by the way, in Denver, which is very good because children deserve to recover too, whether or not their parents or their siblings recover. Children, like families, deserve to recover too. And we were a healthy not-for-profit in the mid-'90s. We're now a $200 million a year healthy not-for-profit, but we're still a not-for-profit, which means what? As we talked about this afternoon, you can't have a mission without a margin. And so we didn't have a lot of money to lobby the insurance companies, lobby against the insurance companies, lobby against the Distilled Spirits Council, lobby against the beer wholesalers who did not want insurance companies to treat mental illness and addiction on par with other chronic illnesses. It wasn't in their best interest as businesses for people to stop drinking. Yeah. We used to have to lobby against prison guards because they were worried that their jobs would go away if the war on drugs shifted as it's now shifting. I'm not sure it should shift as far as you think it should shift. But maybe we'll talk about that later. But nevertheless, it is shifting. Whether you're Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or any of the other presidential candidates, everybody's talking about it. Here we are, it's happening. Back in the mid-'90s, in the dark ages, it wasn't happening. And I don't have time to talk about it tonight, but since we didn't have a lot of money to lobby to get insurance companies to do that, and since we didn't have a lot of troops, as I quoted Winston Churchill this afternoon, he said the scariest thing about being a leader is looking over your shoulder to see that nobody is following. In the mid-90s, nobody was advocating for my illness. A lot of people were advocating for mental illness through the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. Do we have any members of NAMI here tonight? Yeah, hooray. So you could be up here, talk. Why don't you give the rest of this talk? You know what I mean. You guys were way ahead of us, you guys. But you know what I mean. You were way ahead of us in the mid-90s. You had a long way to go. Our hill was this steep. Yours was this steep. It was still steep climbs. But in the mid-90s, Congress was about to pass legislation that would get insurance companies to treat mental illness, but they were going to still exclude people with my disease. And the reason for that is because we didn't stand up and speak out. So I began to tell my own story. And it's gotten better for the last 20 years because I'm 20 years older. The point is I began to lead by example, and we did change things. And I want everybody in this room to know it, that most insurance companies are now required by law to cover addiction and mental illness like they cover all other illnesses. A lot of them aren't doing that yet because we're not holding their feet to the fire, but you need to know for yourselves, your families, your patients, and your clients that insurance companies, they're in the spotlight. We got George Bush to sign that into law, by the way, in October of 2008, and in Obamacare. Addiction and mental illness are one of the covered illnesses as well. Although I read this afternoon that you in Colorado are thinking about chucking Obamacare and just starting your own program. I don't even want to go there. All I want to say is if you do chuck Obamacare, and I say this in red states all the time when I'm down here talking to them, if you do decide to get rid of Obamacare, make sure that whatever you replace it with still covers what brings us into this room tonight, okay? And I've spent my last 20 years of my life dedicated to carrying the message. Not carrying an AA message, not carrying any specific recovery message, but carrying the message of addiction, treatment, and redemption, and in the appropriate audiences, talking about my faith journey as well. The greatest thing that has happened to me that I'm going to try to get through in the next 8 minutes is this. I got hired to change public policy in state houses from Denver to Austin, Texas, to Sacramento, California, to St. Paul, Minnesota, to Albany, New York. I've been all those places. I got hired to change public policy. I got hired to help change public perception. And I do that all the time. The greatest benefit to me, and the part I want to leave you with tonight, the greatest benefit for me in the last 20 years has been what? Well, when I stand up and speak out, I become a beacon of hope, help, and healing for the kinds of people who aren't here tonight, who do not yet know that there is an alternative to their depression or their bipolar disorder or their substance use disorder. When I stand up and speak out, I become a lightning rod. I become, as I said this afternoon, a lint brush. Whenever I roll into a community, I always roll out some people who need help. I'm an accessible addict and alcoholic. Why? Because I share my story in public. Why? Because I'm not famous. Why? Because I'm on Facebook. Why? Because I have an address in the phone book. And whether it's Facebook or Twitter or letters from the penitentiary or on college campuses or when even people who come up and knock on the front door of my house in St. Paul, all they say is, William, can you help me? Because I don't know where else to turn. I would be remiss tonight if I did not empower you either to continue doing what you're doing, particularly for those of you who are associated with a recovery group, advocacy group, or with NAMI, or to get you to start doing it. Because you see, I've given thousands of speeches over the last 20 years. By the way, I really like being here. It's very comfortable. I really do like it. And I don't always can say that. Of course, when I don't like it, I don't say that. But but I can tell you tonight, I really like you. And I love the venue. But a long time ago, I stopped giving speeches that were simply to motivate people or even to raise money. I'll be in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2 nights to help a treatment program down there raise money. I spoke at the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill in Chicago last Saturday night to raise money. And I do a lot of fundraising for groups. We should have charged you guys a lot of money to be here, but for the Interfaith Network. But we'll do that next time, Alan. And you'll be here for it too. But I've stopped giving speeches that motivate or speeches that are interesting for an hour on a cold Thursday night. Because you see, tomorrow morning I'm going to get up, God willing, and with your prayers, get on that airplane and get back to Minnesota for the day. And you're still going to be here working down in the trenches of your own family's struggle, down in the trenches of working for a small not-for-profit, down in the trenches of the detox or the county jail or the state penitentiary. All of you, most of you are probably a lot of professionals in here. You're going to be down in the trenches somewhere, still fighting this fight. And if I motivated you for a night, then I've fallen short of what I really need you to do after I go home. Some of you are doing it. This is what I need the rest of you to do. And then I'm going to close with the story. Number one, this is my call to action. Number one, by the way, is that group at the back there? Are you with the? Are you here at the university? Are you guys at the university? You're so young. No. Okay. There's a recovery campus here, isn't there? Yay! Wow, that didn't even exist 10 years ago. Recovery campus on a college campus. Wow. But this is what I need you to do. Number one, if you're a person in recovery, and you know who you are, if you're recovering from a substance use disorder or you're recovering from a mental illness, if you're a person in recovery, leave here in between now and Sunday. Today's Thursday, so we'll give you 3 days. Between now and Sunday, go back into your community, wherever you came from, and share with somebody who does not know it that you're a person in recovery from one of these illnesses, okay? It may be at a bookstore, maybe at your church on Sunday, maybe at a book club, maybe at a running club. It may be just out on the street. You're so motivated, you just stop a stranger and say, you know what? I'm William Moyers, and I'm in recovery from whatever. So if you're a person in recovery, share that, okay? Somewhere in Boulder County between now and Sunday. Number two, if you're a family member of somebody who has struggled with these issues that bring us here tonight and have either recovered from it or lost that loved one to the illness, it's really important that you as a family member go back out into the Boulder community and share that with somebody who does not know it. Even if your story includes the loss of a loved one from an illness, even if your story includes the loved one who might still be struggling with a substance use disorder or mental illness, your story is as valid as my story is in terms of overcoming it. Because as family members, you're recovering even if your loved one is not. And that's a very powerful thing to be and to represent. The power of recovery, even when the loved one is not recovering. So, if you are a family member, share that with somebody who does not know it, okay? Number three, if you're a professional who works in the field, and can I see a show of hands or people who are working in the field or in private, public? Wow. So a vast majority of you, this is going to be perfect for you. If you're a professional who works in the field, start to talk about your successes. The policymakers in Denver, the County Board of Commissioners in Boulder County, the police chief, all the public servants, all the policy people, they know the problems caused by addiction or substance use or mental illness. They know that. We can't talk about that anymore if we expect to continue to move the dial from ignorance and intolerance to acceptance and treatment and recovery. We're moving it. But it's critical now, probably more than ever, that as professionals who work in the field, you talk about the fact that when you work with people like me, from families like mine, you do make a difference. I know you do not do those jobs for those high salaries that you get paid. Right? You do it because you know you're a professional, right? you know you make a difference in the lives of people like me, right? What do? What kind of professional are you?
I'm a clinical psychologist.
Clinical psychologist, right? Well, maybe you do make a lot of money, but well, there's always one in every crowd. Let's not shame him now. Let's pray for him.
I'm still paying the bills.
He's still paying the bills. Good.
Treatment in psych hospitals for having bipolar disorder and drug and alcohol addiction.
Holy cow. You mean even clinical psychologists who have been addicted and have bipolar recover and get to work in the field? What a motivating story. And it's critical that you start to talk about your successes, your success and the success of the clients you deal with, so that policymakers can then next year maybe earmark a little bit more money off the marijuana tax for prevention, treatment, and recovery. Well, at least you got a tax. Do you know that in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes and 10,000 treatment centers? Do you know that in Minnesota, the alcohol tax has not been raised since 1985? Wow. Why is that? Because the industry has lobbied against it. Since 1985, I live in the birthplace of treatment. And we don't even have the political will to add a nickel a drink tax. We bring that legislation up every year, and every year it gets a little further, and then it dies in committee or whatever. So maybe if you start as professionals to talk about your successes, then that will compel the policymakers to say, oh, yeah, maybe we should do a little bit more funding, either at the state level or at the federal block grant level in Washington. You've got to talk about your successes and the fact that when you do what you do, you help people like me. Whether you're a clinical psychologist or a therapist in the jail or working for the Interfaith Network, start to talk about your successes. I could go on and tell you some other things to do, but at 2 minutes after 8, I'm going to close by telling you, by bringing this back, well, actually to the faith piece, and also to the importance of what's happening in this room tonight. Because the first word of the first step of the 12 steps of the recovery program that some of us recover in is what? We. Addiction and mental illness are illnesses of isolation. And the antidote to them is right here. It's community. And nothing better underscores that, especially in my policy and advocacy work, than this. Excuse me. 3 years ago, I wrote this little book called Now What? By the way, the independent bookstore is here tonight. Coincidentally, they're selling my books. But I want you to support your local bookstore tonight. It's really nice. Broken came out 10 years ago. It's in its fourth printing. I don't know how that happened. And the fact that the independent bookstore came here tonight and sold books. I mean, they're my books. I'm biased, but wow, support your local bookstore. Hoo-ha. But 3 years ago, I wrote this little book called what? Now What? And this is a little primer on how to get people from the problem. Remember the knocking door that day? Now what? From the problem to a solution. I wrote this book to deal with the 5 to 10 requests I get every day. And 95% of those people who reach out and ask me for help never end up at a Hazel and Betty Ford facility. They end up where they need to be, where it's clinically appropriate or where they can afford to go or where it's in their community. Most of the people that I send to treatment go to community-based settings because that's really where recovery lies. In the hood, in the state. And when you can treat people in the state and then put them back out in Boulder and in Aspen and in Buena Vista or wherever they come from, that's what it's all about. So most of the people that I help never end up at my facility, but our mission at Hazel and Betty Ford has always been just to help addicts and alcoholics find help. So I wrote this book. My parents wrote the foreword to this book because they're the parents of a sick person, and it's very appropriate. The reason why I say that is because a couple of years ago, we went out and did a little book tour with this book. Not many. My parents are elderly. My dad's 82. My mother's 81. so they get around. They'll be in St. Paul this weekend raising money for Twin Cities Public Television. But they're slowing down, as any 81-year-olds would do. So, but they did go out and do a couple of events with me. Hang in there, it's going to get better here, I promise. And because I know it's time to go. And so we did 3 events. We did an event at the 92nd Street Y in New York City, which is a place where lots of thinkers go. National Public Radio oftentimes will broadcast the conversations at the 92nd Street Y in New York on subjects like this and other things. So we did one at the 92nd Street Y, we did one at the National Press Club, and then we did one at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas. That was the extent of my parents' promotion of this little book. But at the 92nd Street Y, we had an audience of 900 people. Yeah, it was incredible. What does that tell you? It tells you a lot. We're coming right to that in a minute. We had 900 people that night. We were up on a stage. Susan Cheever, who's a good friend of mine, John Cheever, the actor, his daughter, who wrote I think the best biography of Bill Wilson ever written, the real story of Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, who was flawed in sobriety just like all the rest of us are. He was human. Susan Cheever is the moderator. Then you had Bill Moyers, Judith Moyers, and then the guy bringing up the rear. We took questions from the audience in the same way that we've got this little question thing here. But instead of waiting until the end of the conversation, we had the ushers bring the note cards up during the course of it was a 2-hour event. It was a lot longer than this. Well, Susan Cheever had this, by 20 minutes in, we had a stack of note cards this high. Yeah, there were people in the audience who really, really wanted to know. They had a burning desire to know something about what we were talking about. And Susan, sitting over here, pulled out from the stack of, look how thin this card is. So there's probably, 60 cards? She pulls this card out without reading it. Yeah. And she looks at it. And I've known Susan long enough to know she's a pretty smart person. But she says she knows she's got a hot potato. So she passes it to the next person in the line. The learned, all-world Bill Moyers. My father, who's pretty good on these things, looks at the card, and I can see my father's sort of quizzical look very subtly but perceptibly turn into one of genuine bafflement. And I've known him for 57 years, so I knew what he was doing. So what does my dad do? He passes it to the next person in the line, his wife of 62 years, my mother, Judith, who is a self-proclaimed fixer, which means she's codependent. But my mother can fix anything. No kidding. No kidding. She couldn't ironically fix me, but she could love me until I could get the help of the professionals. And my mother's story, by the way, is prominent and broken. My mother looks at the card, and she doesn't have the answer, so she gives it to me, the last one in the line. And I look at the card in front of 900 people. You cannot see the faces like I can see tonight because the lights are so bright. All you can see is the silhouettes of heads across each aisle. And I looked at this card, and I knew that I had a serious problem on my hands, and that there was somebody out in the audience that I better get this right. I'm not an LADC. I'm not a doctor. I have a BA in journalism after my name. I'm not, and I'm very careful about telling people I'm not a clinician. I'm not a doc. I can help people, and I'm a beneficiary of good clinical work, but I'm not the expert that way. But there's no one left in the line, and I'm going to have to answer this question. Because the question is this: what do you do if you don't want to live? What do you do if you don't want to live? There's somebody in New York City in that audience that night who does not want to live. And I couldn't give a flippant answer, but I couldn't give an authorized answer because I'm not the medical or psychological expert. What do you do if you want to live? So I thought about it for about another 1 or 2 seconds. And then I realized where the answer was. And so I said, looking out there, not knowing who it was, I said, turn to the person next to you and ask for help. That night, that answer came to me as clearly as the whisper in my ear of St. Paul so many years before. I couldn't be flippant. I couldn't afford to be, I had to just lay it out there. And I was up on the stage. I didn't know who it was. So I said, turn to the person next to you and ask for help. There was a big gasp over the audience. And then we went on with the program. After it was over, a woman came up to the front of the stage. There were hundreds of people there still. And she handed me a piece of paper with a phone number on it. And the person who had written, what do you do if you don't want to live, had turned to what proved to be a psych nurse sitting next to him and said, I need help. And she said, give me your phone number. And she brought that phone number up to me afterwards. And that night, when I got back to the hotel in the city of 12 or 15 million people, I called that number. And a man answered. And he said, I need help. The next day, we got him some patient aid into Hazelden in New York City. And he began down that road of recovery from his co-occurring disorder. This morning, actually this afternoon, after our lunch, I emailed him. If he walked in here right now, I wouldn't know him. I've never met him. I talk to him all the time. I said, Don G, how you doing? He said, William, I haven't had the thought of killing myself since that day, and I've been sober for 66 days. Point being, he's still with us. He's recovering. It hasn't been easy in the last 3 years. But on that night, when I heard the answer to the question, what do you do if you don't want to live? I knew in that audience were people who were just like he was, just like I was. Loving, caring, compassionate, professional people. People just like us. What we all owe to those who are not here tonight is hope. We may not be able to save all of them. In fact, some of us are not qualified to save any of them. But as people who have been there and done that in various ways, that we've been there and done that to the point that you've taken the last hour and 15 minutes to come here tonight, what we can be is that bridge between what happens when you don't want to live and the answer. An answer that manifests itself in this closing. This is from the epigraph of my first book. A disciple asks the Rebbe, why does Torah tell us to place these words upon your hearts? Why does Torah not tell us to place these holy words in our hearts? The Rebbe answers, well, it is because as we are, our hearts are closed, and we cannot place the holy words in our hearts. So we place them on top of the hearts, and there the holy words stay until one day the heart breaks and the words fall in. What do you do when you don't want to live? We've all had our moments, and here we are. Our obligation is to let other people know why we came here tonight, and to be ready when somebody turns to each of you and asks for help, so that next year when we get together, the people who are in despair tonight will be out here in the audience as well. The stakes are high, but so too are the rewards. Thank you very much. So I know a lot of people are going to have to go. We ran over. Feel free to do that. But I'm happy to take a couple of questions and sign some books for the next short time that we have. Ann, how do you want to do it? I'll repeat the question, too.
I got one here.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Just passed to me.
How do you help someone who won't accept help when they are very unhappy and not functioning well? Well, that is the true dilemma, isn't it? That how do you help somebody who doesn't want help? Well, one way you do it is you keep the line of communication open. It is okay to hate the disease that afflicts them, but you've got to continue to love the person who has that disease. That doesn't mean that you give them more than the bus fare if they ask you for $40, but that you keep that line of communication open, that you always invite them to dinner at your house on a Sunday night or some other special night of the week. Keep the door and the line of communication open. Let them know that you won't tolerate their behavior, but if and when they're ready to get help, you will help them. That is one of the hardest things in the world, to let go of somebody that you love. But what's the alternative? Because as we know, you cannot make somebody get well. Not even a drug court can do that anymore. And so what you've got to do is keep that communication open, keep loving them, keep offering them hope. Don't enable them. But in the meantime, take care of yourself as well, because you'll never be able to help your loved one if you cannot take care of yourself during that process. Yes. Go ahead. Okay.
Oh, I don't know which one.
Here's another one. What could your parents have done differently? Well, we ask that question all the time. And there is one answer that I've actually come to that's evolved to me. What we could have done was two things. My parents, we should have, hindsight's 20/20. So I'm not being critical. We never, as I alluded to, we never talked about addiction in my family. And we should have. You know why? Because my dad's brother, Uncle James, committed suicide in 1966 while working in the White House with my dad. My dad is 8 years younger than his older brother. My dad was the big success. Uncle James lived in my father's shadow. Uncle James died in 1966. We were told as children that our uncle had died from throat cancer. He was a heavy smoker and he had cancer. But it was only 66, 76, 30 years later, no, 23 years later, that I learned that, in fact, what killed my Uncle James was an overdose of prescription medication. And that in his suicide note, he blamed his brother, my father, for his death. Yes, we never talked about that. In fact, it didn't come out until I saw my father weeping, lying on my bed in treatment in 1989 in Hazel, when my parents had come out for the family program, that I began to learn the full extent of the fact that I, too, my grandmother, his mother, James's mother, always compared me to her son. And I am a type A personality. And my grandmother didn't know that I was addicted back in the 80s, but it's clear to me now that I had all of the genetics. So my parents, what we should have done was we should have talked about it. We should have talked about it. And for parents who now have the benefit of hindsight, or grandparents, what we need to tell our young people is it's okay to ask for help. We never talked about that. It's okay to ask for help. And so I lived in fear and shame and desperation and denial about my situation until I ran out of options. So that's what my parents could have probably done differently. What about getting faith-based groups to talk about addiction? So I know that I was told that there are probably some clergy here tonight, but there's not enough clergy here tonight. Every clergy should be required to offer a sermon twice a year on mental health and addiction issues from a healing perspective, a non-judgmental perspective. Every church ought to have a program in it made up of volunteers who are willing to offer themselves as a resource. There used to be a group called Faith Partners that I know was successful in some churches based out of Austin, Texas. I don't know that it's still around. But churches, in the same way that churches were engaged in the civil rights movement, I believe churches owe it to their parishioners and to their communities, their congregants, to embrace all of the issues that afflict the congregation, including substance use disorders and mental illness issues. And I believe that seminaries should be required to offer courses in training, or courses around how to work with communities that are struggling with substance use disorders and mental illness. Which cities in the U.S. do you think have the best programs or approaches to dealing with drug addiction and criminal justice? Give examples of what's working. I think all the sponsors that are in this row right here, I think they're part of that solution, without a doubt. Without a doubt. They're all sponsors here tonight, and I'm not saying that because they're sponsors. I know some of you, raise your hands if you're among the sponsors here tonight. So there you go. Some of it's right here. I don't know. I think the best is what meets the patient's needs and meets the patient or the client where they're at, not where they need to be. I'm biased. I like Hazel and Betty Ford. I worked there, but I'm a product of there, even though I relapsed out of there twice. I got sober in Atlanta. There are a lot of good programs. I know that the Salvation Army is a very good program for people who don't have any other options and are serious about, following the program. I don't know that you have a good Salvation Army here in Boulder County, but they offer good programs too. Here's the thing. I don't think there's one size shoe fits all. AA got jammed down the throats of lots and lots of people who just weren't going to be patients and clients who would embrace that modality of treatment. And I think it's taken us a long time to recognize that there are many pathways to recovery. The ones that work best and the ones we should insist on are those that treat the patient or the client with dignity and respect. Whatever that is. And if it includes the use of medication to treat opiate addiction, great. It should. We've started to do that at Hazelden. We're an abstinence-based program. But our opiate addicts were doing great in treatment and then relapsing and dying when they got out. And so we've started to use Suboxone and Vivitrol in a way that enhances the recovery opportunities or chances for our opiate patients. I think addiction needs to, the good programs are those that can meld themselves and roll along with and keep up with what research is teaching us about this disease in unprecedented ways, helping us to understand the intricacies of the brain and the soul piece as well. So there's a question back there, but let me, go ahead, ask it. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Sure. And I want to come back to emptiness in just a second. Sure, there are other addictions. Internet addiction, pornography addiction. I don't understand those. They still have the same impact on the brain circuitry in the sense of the reward system. I get that. I don't talk about them because I'm not an expert. But at the same time, I know full well, I know people who are addicted to gambling. And unfortunately, I think we've labeled as an addictive behavior some excesses that really aren't addictions. But I'm not going to go there. That's not my expertise. I do know that there are a lot of people who need help. By the way, that filling the soul with money and things like that, a lot of people will say to me, so William, you don't use anymore. So how do you fill this soul, this hole? Because I still have it. I still have this, which is in remission, and I have this, although this has been tested actually in the last year and a half too. But I have this thing. So what do I fill it with? Well, part of what I don't fill it with substances. I fill it with this. I fill it with writing. I fill it with helping other people. I fill it even with accepting my shortcomings, of which I have a lot. And I learn more about my shortcomings the older I get. I guess it's called wisdom. But thanks for the extra water, but I fill this with giving back and trying to help people. I want to say something too. I know we have a lot more questions, but I had a run-in with pain meds a year and a half to 2 years ago. And that's part of the epidemic. There is a true epidemic in this country now. Opiate overdoses kill more people than traffic accidents in America. Yeah, and the reason why is because we're an overprescribed nation. 90% of the world's opium is consumed by one country. There are opiate prescriptions written. There are 5 opiate prescriptions written for every man, woman, and child in America.
Wow.
Yeah, that doesn't mean they're all taking them, but what that means is some people are taking a lot of them. This opiate epidemic is really like any other epidemic of substances that have been around. There have been epidemics of alcohol in colonial America. There was the methamphetamine epidemic. There was the crack epidemic that I got swept in the late 80s. They're all sort of fall under the term epidemic. But this opiate epidemic is much bigger than that, much, much bigger. I got caught in it a year and a half ago. And what was really interesting about it was I had dental surgery. I have no teeth over here on the lower right side, and I'm leaving that alone for now until I can get off the road in June, and then we'll get the work done. But I had major dental surgery done. I'm as transparent an addict and alcoholic as there is, right? I write books and so on. 3 of the 4 doctors that prescribe me opiates are recovering doctors who happen to be Hazel alums. Yeah, but I was getting prescriptions for opiates to control and deal with this pain and not seeking alternatives to controlling this pain with opiates, to the point that I now call opiates the Trojan horse of addiction. Scary, man. It's scary. And if there's any question at all that I was an addict and an alcoholic in remission, it was when I started popping those opiate pills, legally and legitimately prescribed for my vast dental work that I had. And I said, oh yeah, I remember those days. Oh yeah, and I was never an opiate addict. I used heroin one time. I hated it. Oh yeah. And when I took those Percocets or those Tramadols even, not only did it soothe this thing, but it lit this thing up again. Wow. And I want to tell you something. You know the singer Judy Collins? She's not from Colorado, but yes, she is. She's a really good friend of mine. I was really good friends with her son Clark. And if you've heard Judy talk, Judy's son Clark killed himself in 1992. I saw Clark in the psych ward in New York, in Minnesota. He was living in Minnesota. He'd come out from New York and gotten treatment. I'm not violating any confidentiality. Judy's open about this. Clark was too. He'd come out from New York and gotten sober and was a school teacher in the St. Paul schools, and he relapsed after 8 years of recovery. I went and saw him in the psych ward after he tried to kill himself the first time. Suicide ran in their family, by the way. Judy's written about that. And I said to Clark at the time, I said, Clark, what happened, man? Oh, how did you get to this point? He said, William, I ran out of insurance. And he wasn't talking about health insurance. He was talking about the insurance that we all pay into our recovery programs. It's kind of like our retirement funds. Don't we all have retirement funds for what reason? To use them one day. We don't save money in our retirement accounts not to ever draw down on them, right? We anticipate that when we turn 62 or 65 or whatever, we're going to start to draw down on our retirement accounts. Well, guess what recovery is? Recovery is like a retirement account. You got to put it in. You know why? Because one day you're going to take it out. And when Clark told me in 92, William, I ran out of insurance, I stopped paying premiums, I began drawing down on it, and 2 weeks after he told me that, he killed himself. Well, I had this run-in with pain meds, and even my faith, even my getting on my knees and saying, God, I know where I'm going here. Can you help me? That just wasn't going to do it. You know, I had to draw down on a lot of what I had invested in, which is why they talk about it being a day at a time. I hate that phrase, but it's true. And if you can get somebody who's suffering from depression or PTSD or bipolar to take their medication and be in their support groups and work on their therapy and do all that stuff, then what you're doing to them is the same thing that addicts and alcoholics are getting in their recoveries. They're building up time. They're building up resources so that when they have a flare-up of their bipolar disorder or PTSD or alcoholism, they can draw down and they can get back on the pathway in a way that doesn't result in them dying. And I learned a lot about addiction being cunning, baffling, powerful, and patient with my own experience with opiates a year and a half ago. There's more to recovery than abstinence and more to sobriety and more to recovery than sobriety. So This is a thing I'm going to write about. And I know we got to get out of here, but this whole phrase, there's more to recovery, there's more to sobriety than abstinence, and there's more to recovery than sobriety. I know people who are committed to their recoveries even though they're not sober. You get that? And by the way, what is sobriety? Bill Wilson didn't have a drink for 35 years, but he smoked himself to death. And he used nicotine to maintain his abstinence from alcohol. When I had my big run-in with pain meds, I wasn't sober. Hardly was I sober, but I was committed to recovery. I tried to live the principles of my recovery, you know. So what I've been playing around, and I think this is important because our field gets judged differently when it comes to success and outcomes than does any other chronic disease. Do you know the recovery rates for addiction are equal to or greater than the recovery rates for asthma, diabetes, and hypertension combined? Well, we don't hold asthmatics or hypertensives to the same community or societal expectation that we hold addicts and alcoholics or people with mental illness. And what's really important is that we come up with a series of benchmarks that will measure the success of the clients you deal with or that are dealt with at the programs or that are represented here tonight. Because it isn't, if we just measure abstinence, what good is abstinence if you don't have a job? What good is recovery if you don't have a roof over your house? What is recovery if you're smoking cigarettes? You're not sober, you know? And so I was in recovery when I was running into this really interesting dynamic with pain meds. I was in recovery. I was doing my meditations. I was connecting up there. I was reading my literature. I was committed. I wasn't sober. And what good is abstinence if you're still cheating on your income taxes or breaking the law or engaging in behaviors that you shouldn't be engaging in? You know, so I'm exploring this whole theme of what it all means because we've got to figure out how we're going to measure success because that's how we're being reimbursed by insurance companies. Insurance companies, one thing they'll do is they'll say, well, we're going to give you per patient, we're going to give you a certain amount of money. You can use that money however you want to treat your patients, but we want to see the outcome of what you do. And yet, as I say to patients all the time, treatment is easy. Treatment is easy. What's hard is what's going on out there. It's easy to stop you. Think I stopped 1,000 times. It's hard to stay stopped. And what does that mean in the context? So we've got to come up with these benchmarks so that we can tell people that what we do really does work. Question, how do you deal with someone who's, how do you deal with someone whose addiction and mental illness is hurting the family? Well, it's up to the family to recover, even if the loved one doesn't. Right, Joanne? Right, all you other parents and grandparents? You got to recover. And I know that's hard. I know it's hard. But you got to recover for yourselves because, as you know, you can't make your loved one take their lithium or go to AA or do all the other things they need to do to recover from their illness. All you can really do is to take care of yourself and leave that line, as I said earlier, leave that line of communication open so that when your loved one is ready, you're there to help them. Yes?
Well, I think there's one other thing that those of us who are parents and that one reason why it's so hard for us is because it's not like when there's other illnesses, there's a community that supports the person who's sick.
Right.
So the more support we can get in the world, in the community, to help with the illness, then the parent isn't left
Alone. Well, look at this tonight. I mean, we're just a fraction of what is the population of Boulder?
100,000.
What is it? 100,000. We're just a teeny tiny fraction. But if everybody in here went out and did what I asked you to do in terms of sharing, then that many more, this number of people times 2, you know, would there be double the number of people in Boulder who would then understand more about addiction or mental illness than understand it tonight. And you know, you might even, and so that then that's how you have to do it. We got to start talking about it. We just have to, I mean, not start, we got to continue to talk about it. NAMI pioneered that back in the 90s and early 2000s and did very well with it. We're coming around to that. Did anyone see the movie The Anonymous People? That movie really talks about how we in recovery from substance use disorders have been getting out there and speaking as family members and as people in recovery. But it isn't going to change if we don't change the dialogue and lead it ourselves. Yes?
So I just wanted to share that there's an Al-Anon, Parents Helping Parents, and most of us, our kids are using things like heroin and meth, and it's every Sunday at 10:15 in the basement of the hospital on Broadway. And I just wanted to ask, you said there are other roads to recovery other than the 12 steps.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who recover by just taking their medication, you know, and then getting on with their lives. There are, yes, were you going to say something about the other programs? Go ahead.
The website, Faces and Voices of Recovery, they have a great mutual aid list. You go on the website, they list all the different types of recovery, life frame, celebrate, and all.
Lots of recovery ways, yeah. A lot of people recover in church. They go to, that's their true faith-based. Look, I just want to say, we've gone way over. Thank you all so much for what you're doing in this community. When I leave here and go home tomorrow, as I said to the group earlier today, I'm going to go home knowing that you all are back here making a tremendous difference in the lives of people. You are helping to place those words on their hearts so that one day when they're ready, their hearts will break and the words of compassion and love and professionalism that you all espouse and embody, that those words will fall in. And to know that there's a community like there is here, an interfaith network, it gives me great hope. It gives me great hope for those who deserve exactly what all of us have had. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm going to go out and do the books, yeah.
You said have them come into the house and have dinner and stuff, but what if they're in your house?
Then you've got to, I don't know, you're going to have to get an order of protection, right? Yeah, that's a great point.
It's hard to not have them there. They're in the street otherwise.